Welcome friends to another Dune video. Today we draw on the original Dune novel by Frank Herbert and examine the scene where Paul Atreides and Miles Spoilers, Gurney Halleck are reunited. So after the fall of the Atreides, Gurney fell in with spice smugglers, rising in their ranks, and used that position to hurt the Harkonnens. And then, 2 years after the fall of Paul's father, Gurney and his smugglers find themselves caught in a possible trap set by Muad'Dib. The smugglers' spice factory, with its parent carrier and ring of drone ornithopters, came over a lifting of dunes like a swarm of insects following its queen. Gurney on board is commanding an ornithopter to look at a place for a spice blow, and he sets his forces up to protect them from any ambush. He was deep in the desert, so it was unlikely the Harkonnens could reach him here, but the Fremen might. It was reported back to him that the spice is a rich patch and they get closer. He left the spice factory with 5 men to examine it, and his larger forces are deployed. He climbed up the ridge to reach the spice patch, and then suddenly things erupted. In a moment, the Thopters were shot down. A rocket was used, also on his crawler. Gurney shocked the Fremen can use rockets. Hooded fighting men came from the rocks. Then he was face to face with a hooded figure who crouched low, crysknife at the ready. 2 more men stood waiting on the rocks, above, to left, and right. Only the eyes of the fighting man ahead of him were visible to Gurney, between hood and veil of a sand-coloured burnous, but the crouch and readiness warned him that they were a trained fighting man, a danger. The eyes were the blue in blue of the deep desert Fremen. Gurney moved one hand towards his own knife, kept his eyes fixed on the other's knife. If they dared use rockets, they'd have other projectile weapons too. This moment argued extreme caution. He could tell by sound alone that at least part of his skyed cover had been knocked out. There were gruntings too, the noise of several struggles behind him. The eyes of the fighting man ahead of Gurney followed the motion of hand towards knife. They came back to glare into Gurney's eyes. "Leave the knife in its sheath, Gurney Halleck," the man said. "You've no need of a knife with me, Gurney." The man followed up, and he reveals himself to be Paul Atreides, as Gurney knew him, now Paul Muad'Dib. Paul says that Gurney must tell his men to submit. He does, but half his people are dead already, and Gurney sees the new steel in Paul. "They said you were dead," Gurney repeated, "and it seemed the best protection to let them think so," Paul replied. They then embraced. "You young pup, you young pup," Gurney said. Gurney sees how the Fremen have become wise in battle tactics and says if he'd known Paul was alive, nothing would have stopped him coming. Paul says it would have raised questions about him still being alive. Gurney says his men are smugglers, and Paul notices an Atreides hand code from Gurney to his men, and Paul signals Stilgar. Gurney meets the siege leader. Stilgar says to Paul, "You are his duke." Gurney saw it was true, and some dead part of him came back to life. Paul explains how the spice Gurney saw was a thin layer, a trap. Gurney says only a few more of Leito's men lived apart from him, and he stayed on the planet because Raban, who hurt Gurney's sister, is on Arrakis. A maker approaches. Paul is disappointed they could not save the spice harvester. Gurney makes a point that Leto would have been more concerned about his fallen men. Paul says to him the men with Gurney were trespassers to them. Calling the one maker, and with what he just said, Paul has fully embraced here his Fremen role. Paul then observes how the Harkonnen forces are stuck in one place. They are not mobile, they cannot move around, while Paul and his forces can. He says, "You taught me that, Gurney." They have lost the initiative, and so they have lost the war. Paul asks Gurney if he will finish the campaign with him, and Halleck says he never left his service. Gurney then meets Chani, and then watches the sandcrawler disappear. Paul explains they have many such hiding places. Then Gurney is introduced to Chani. He says that Chani is Paul's woman. Paul says yes, and also the mother of his firstborn. Gurney's eyes widen in response. Gurney points out the new members of his crew that he does not trust. Harkonnen spies, maybe, he observes. Gurney, more likely they are Sardaukar, Paul says. Paul says they will decide what to do with Gurney's people after the storm has passed, and Gurney recalls stories he'd been told of Muad'Dib, the Listen al-Gaib, how he had taken the skin of a Harkonnen officer to make his drumheads, how he was surrounded by death commandos, Vedekeen, who leapt into battle with a death chants on their lips. Korba has saved Gurney's balisette and says Paul has spoken of it many times, and hands it over. But Gurney senses an edge of challenge in him. Paul then says to all who listen, I would have you be friends. Gurney says to Stilgar, any killer of the Harkonnens will be a friend of his. They enter a Fremen retreat and seal the door. Glow globes lit the way, and there was a moment of safety before fighting breaks out. It was the Fremen fighting men who wear smugglers' robes. The smugglers' close fighting formation marked them as Sardaukar. A knife thrown at Paul misses, but Gurney looks at it, and it bore the Imperial Royal Lion crest. 3 Sardaukar remained after. Paul says to hold them for questioning, and speaks to the Sardaukar who seems to be the one in authority. Paul says it's obvious they were ordered to come for him under the guise of spice smugglers. The Sardaukar captain gives his name, Armasham, Captain Armasham, and then the man at the captain's left leapt without warning towards Paul, and met the flashing impact of his own captain's knife in his chest. The attacker hit the floor in a sudden heap. With the knife still in him, the captain faced his sole remaining companion. I decide what's best in service to His Majesty, he said. Understood? The other Sardaukars' shoulders slumped. Drop your weapon, the captain said. Sardaukar obeyed, so the last 2 are taken prisoner. And Paul tells Korba how to identify Sardaukar in the future. The failure was mine, Korba, Paul said. I should have warned you what to seek. In the future, when searching Sardaukar, remember this. Remember too that each has a false toenail or 2 that can be combined with other items secreted about their person to make an effective transmitter. They'll have more than 1 false tooth. They carry coils of sugar wire in their hair, so fine you can barely detect it, yet strong enough to grow at a man and to cut off his head in the process. With Sardaukar, you must scan them, scope them, both reflex and hard ray, cut off every scrap of body hair, and when you're through, be certain you haven't discovered everything. Paul then asks Gurney if there are guildsmen around Raban. Paul says, we control it, Gurney, and it's the most precious thing to them, referring to the spies. Gurney corrects him, saying it's the most precious thing to the Harkonnens, and Paul says, the people who can destroy a thing, they control it. And with our little look at their reunion, I'll end today's video. I like the surprises Gurney has to face about Paul, the revelation of the son, the partner, etc. And also when he realizes that Paul is Muad'Dib, this legend that he'd heard people speak about. And I also like how he falls into the role of advisor for his new duke, as Stilgar puts it. And how we also see Paul has learned a lot from the Balisette player in terms of strategy and has never stopped speaking about him. So much so that even Korba, one of Paul's Vedekeen, if I recall, has heard of the legends of Gurney Halleck.